a Bahian trance reflecting the best and worst of Brazilian childhood. Bom dia tudo! Welcome everyone to another episode of the Mere Mortals Book Reviews. I am Kyron here, coming at you live on the 19th of September 2024. And the Book Reviews, as you might surmise, is the podcast where I talk about the hardships of my rough Brazilian upbringing. Okay, no, that's not what this podcast is about, but we will be talking about that today in today's book, which is Capitães Da Areia by Jorge Amado. So this book was published in 1937, 342 pages in length, and took me a whopping 20 hours to get through in total. I'll talk more about why it took me so long a little bit later. It's a coming-of-age story set in the 1930s Brazilian town of Salvador, which is situated in Bahia, which is in the kind of northeast coast of Brazil. And so what we see is we follow a group of orphan children, adolescents, who live without care under a pier. And notice I said without care, not without a care, but without care. So they don't have any real guidance. They are truly just a wild band of kids. And so they know the streets better than anyone. And honestly, they're a bit of a menace to the city authorities. So the story is told largely from the perspective of a narrator, but looking at this group as a total, in particular focusing on the chief, Pedro Bala, but we get to know a lot of the other characters and kids. There's probably about 8 or 9 particular ones in total, and I'll talk more about them a little bit later. We really see them grow from young teenagers, even children, I guess you'd call them, to young men. And this is through a haze of good and bad experiences, and takes over the course of probably like a 3 to 4 year period. So we see them robbing, we see them stealing, we see them going to jail, we see them catching the plague and even some deaths. But we also see the good stuff of carnivals, of music, of dancing, capoeira, and even lovemaking with some of the other little kids who are running around, which is a little bit weird, to be honest. So let's jump into the themes, and there's a lot of swirling and mixing themes of this book in total. There's treatment of rich versus poor, or the opposite of poor versus rich. We see young love, we see religious faith, becoming a man, loyalty to the group. It's kind of like an Oprah episode, to be honest. You get a theme, you get a theme, you get a theme. If you want a theme, there's a theme to be found within this book. I instead want to focus on the dreamlike state of childhood. This book is all about children and growing up, and I think this is a worthy theme to reflect upon. So, in particular, the state of living in it versus reflecting afterwards is what I want to examine, because I've sort of teased 2 different type of characters in this book, reflecting of childhood and how we see some have a more I wouldn't call it idyllic, but they approach childhood in a very different manner than some of the other ones. And so this story, as I mentioned, is told by a narrator and really focusing on Pedro. But we have this group of kids running around the city, and at times you feel this carefree nature within the words of the book and what they're doing. Even when it's kind of hard times, you think that everything will turn out fine no matter what, or not exactly fine, but there's no anxiety about the future. There's no worrying about, am I going to fail my parents? Am I going to get a university degree? Am I going to disappoint anyone? There's really none of that. It's literally like wake up the next day, let's go get some food somehow. If I've got some rags and my, rags are falling apart, I'll get some clothes somehow. There's no real anxiety or worrying too much, or at least that's not what we see. In real life, who knows? But this is a fictional book, so we're not going to examine that too deeply, or maybe a little bit at the end. This is sort of reflected, I guess, within the nicknames of a lot of the kids, and you get this feeling of this predestiny and of perhaps what is to come for them for the rest of their life. And there's some big spoilers incoming here, so if you don't want to know more about the book, then probably best to skip this section. So listing off some of the characters, we have O Gato, aka the cat, who likes finery and women. He's a rather precocious young man who ends up sleeping with a prostitute when he's, I don't know how old he is. He's got to be like less than 16. So a little bit already. We have João Grande, aka the Big, who is a strong ego simpleton who's rather he's a very nice. He's actually got some really strong morals, even though he's portrayed as rather dumb or idiotic. We have Sempernas, aka Without Legs, a small cripple filled with hate. This kid is just bitter against the world. We have O Professor, aka the Professor, a well-read artistic soul with, I think, kind of bad eyesight, but who is rather talented and creative, I guess you'd call him. We have Volta Seca, the Dry Gulch. He's almost like an idealistic villain, and he's the son of Lampião, who is a famous Brazilian cangaceiro, a kind of like outlaw, a bushman, a bandit, and he wants to rejoin his father and fight against oppression, particularly against the rich people. We have Boa Vida, aka Good Life, who loves samba and parties, and I believe he's the one who's got amazing abilities to whistle or tell jokes or to sing. We also have Pireluto, aka Lollipop, who's a religious celibate adherent. He finds out about God and is just obsessed with idols and figures and praising and worshiping God. And then this is outside of the group, but this is also a guy with a nickname, is Querido de Dois, who is aka loved by God, and he is a capoeirista adult who is a friend of the group. He kind of helps them out. He teaches them how to do capoeira and things like this. So that's kind of like a little introduction to the types of kids and people we see in the group. Most of them are from the age of 13 to 16. It's kind of hard to tell. They don't particularly say the age numbers, or if they do, it's glanced over very quickly. When you separate these characters from the others, it feels like childhood. It really does feel like these kids are just having fun. Sure, they have some problems, but it's not like it's really a bad situation that they're in. Yes, they're orphans. Yes, life is cruel to them at times, but even through the cruel times, you don't get this feeling of like menace or of a really hard life. They can rob with impunity, for example. They go out and follow their interests. They stay with the group, and that will be their life. They're not looking too far ahead. Dramatization is used in this book, I think, to reflect this as well, where we see these kids eventually going on to do the things that they're already doing as they're already portrayed, which is kind of why it feels like it's just a natural fit for them. They're not worried about like, am I going to be an astronaut? Am I going to be this or this? It's literally like Boa Vida likes to party and do samba. So when he becomes an adult, a young adult, he goes to party and samba as an adult. We have let's take someone like Volta Seca. He praises Lampião. He wants to join the group. He literally gets on a train and joins the cangaceiros and becomes one of them and meets his dad. We can see this with some of the characters, and the dramatization is this way of portraying a fictional backstory or perhaps future of an actual real life person. And I've teased these out. I'm not exactly sure if there's a couple of them which I am rather sure of, but for example, Volta Seca, who was this kid who joined the Lampião group and actually ended up being kind of a murderer, going to jail for a long time, very violent. His name was actually where was it? Is it João? No. Samuel Francisco? No. I think he's Antonio dos Santos. Sorry, there's so many of them. We also see the professor. I believe he became his kind of life story was modeled on a guy named João José Rescala. And then Querido de Dois is actually a capoeirista who was an actual capoeirista known as, let's get his name right here, Samuel Francisco Barreto de Souza. So what we see with this, I guess, is just these kids have a little spark within them, their personality, their character. You kind of get to see this as kids are growing up and they're entering their teenage years. They then just go on to kind of fulfill their destiny in some sort of ways. It's not magic realism, but I felt a similar sort of thing reading something like Cien Años de Soledad by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, where you see these characters and they kind of feel into what they were like as a child is what they become as an adult. And I could keep going on about all of these. The religious kid becomes a priest or like an apprentice priest. I don't know what they're called. João Grande, like he goes and becomes a marinero. He becomes a sailor. Piruluto, sorry, not Piruluto, the Sempernas, the cripple filled with hate, he ends up committing suicide. There's all of these things where you're like, okay, I could kind of see that. And if I had to guess what they would end up as, assuming bad things didn't happen to them for being the Capitães Da Areia, then yeah, okay, we'll kind of, it's predictable. It's predictable. Now, separating these characters, if you contrast them with the characters without nicknames who just use their actual names, and there's really only three. We have Pedro Bala, the chieftain of the group, the Capitães. He's slightly older than the rest, but he's a natural-born leader. We have Dora, she is introduced rather late in the book, actually, probably in the last third, with her younger brother, who is an orphan, and they're orphaned by the plague. Their mother dies, they can't find work, and so they join the Capitães, even though she's a girl, and in particular, I believe she's probably 12 or 13, just entering into pubescent, and almost gets raped by the group. So it's like, oof, okay, she got lucky. And then we also have the adult Padre Jose Pedro, who is a priest who takes pity on these kids. He is one who recognizes even though they're naughty, they're bad, they're stealing, they're robbing, they're actually, they've got daggers and stuff. They fight. I don't know if I think they have actually killed people at times as well. They're not. He views them not as they're shaped by their circumstances, and that these kids aren't actually bad. They're not under the pier and the bridge because they're bad. They've kind of become bad because they've forced under the pier and bridge by circumstances of being orphans, of not finding a home and things like this. So these characters all seem rather different, the ones without nicknames, and if I had to tease it apart, I would say it's because they all have a responsibility that the other ones don't. All the other ones, they could live their childhood, they could run, play in the sand, they didn't have to worry about things. Pedro Bala obviously is the chief of the group, so he needs to be making decisions. Dora, she initially is the, having to care for a younger brother, like much younger, 7-year-old brother or something. And then she eventually becomes kind of like the mother or sister of the group, is how it's described in the book. And so she feels a responsibility towards them as well, and in helping them out and kind of providing for their needs, such as sewing on clothes, cooking and things like this. And then the adult as well, obviously, he's looking after the group, but in a different form. He's not the leader, but he's trying to guide them and help them in the ways that he best can. And so this gives them a seriousness, I think, that the others lack, or perhaps some more depth of character, in the sense of they can't live in this idyllic trance of childhood. They can't just run around and have fun. They need to be thinking of the future. If this happens, what happens now? I need to make a decision related to this. And they have to make some hard decisions. You see when one of the kids contracts the plague, Pedro has to decide, okay, am I going to kick him out of the group and make him homeless, or are we going to take care of him even though there's risk to us? We see him having to decide to accept Dora into the group. Dora having to decide, even though these kids almost just raped me, am I going to stay with them and trust them? We see the Padre having to lie to the higher ups to try and get help to them to steal from his own kind of charity box in the church to help try and provide for them. We see them doing a lot of things where it's like, okay, there's a lot of decisions they have to make, and they can't live in this childlike haze. They have to be serious. At the end of the book, we start off with the Capitães, with this group. They're well renowned. They're all, a lot of the book is them just going with the flow and doing things. Even though we see snippets of Pedro Bala and Jose Padre, Jose, what was his name? Padre Jose and daughter having to make some tougher decisions. And we see, okay, that their lives are impacted materially and in a negative way by their decision they're making as well. Daughter ends up dying it's not exactly sure what she dies from. It kind of seems like a really bad flu. And at the end of the book, as everyone's kind of maturing and we see everyone else going to do their thing that they're meant to do, the cat, he goes to another city and with this prostitute and ends up like doing card tricks and stealing from people and is dressed like a fine gentleman and all this sort of stuff. What we see with Pedro Bala, for example, is that he's the one who kind of seeing everyone leaving, and he doesn't really have anything for himself. He's like, well, what the hell do I do now with my life? Like, I can't stay under this bridge the rest of my life. It's the Capitães Da Areia. We're a group of kids. He kicks out any kids who are showing signs of pedophilia, and I don't believe there's any of them who are technically adults of 18 or more. So he recognizes his time is coming to an end. What does he do now? And we see him having to question a bit more his life rather than the others who just naturally go off to do their own things. He ends up finding something, and it's kind of predictable in that his father used to be a striker, and then it's like, all right, well, he'll become an activist of sorts. But I think there is a real differentiation between these people where responsibility, I believe, is what really separates a child from responsibility and thinking of the future is what separates like a child from a man in a certain case. And I think that's shown within this book. So I think that's it for the themes. I also kind of wanted to touch upon the group as a whole, the Capitães Da Areia, like the captains of the sand. But I think I've already gone on a little bit too long, so we'll leave that for this time. Let's talk about the author and maybe some extra details. Jorge Amado. He's a very well-known Brazilian author, likely because his works were adapted into film, TV, and for the theater. So I was actually given this book, and I read it in the actual physical form, not on my Kindle, by my good friend Lucas here in Brazil. And I wasn't sure if this was a popular book or not. It was just, he gave it to me and said, yeah, this is worth reading. When I mentioned I was reading it to other Brazilians, a lot of them seemed to know of it. So it made sense to me that this book is relatively well known. And one of the reasons it took me so long to read was I was reading it in Portuguese. I'm learning Portuguese at the moment, or was at the time. And so it was a lot of slow going. It was a lot of me having to stop to translate certain words. And there was a whole bunch of words which were very difficult and which aren't necessarily translatable. You have to go do some Google searching to find out. So finding out about cangaceiros, a lot about these obscure religions, slang for certain words, and especially when they're speaking, much like in Australian English, they would cut certain words. So instead of esto, it'd be just to. And there's a lot of things where it was like, okay, this reduced my comprehension of the book certainly slightly, but because I spent so much time on it, it also gave me a lot more time reading it and reflecting on the book. So it's a bit of a mix with that. And I did pick up the pace towards the end. The first third of it probably took the same amount of time as the 2 second thirds. So I did manage to get a little bit quicker. Apparently some people consider this socialist propaganda. I was reading that, written about this book, as Amado was a rather political figure. I believe he actually went into politics towards the end of his life. But not knowing this and being from the outside, I certainly didn't see it. It didn't come across preachy or with a intent message, much like something like any of Ayn Rand's works, for example, where there is a very strong political bent to it. So I didn't particularly got that. I felt this as a work of fiction, and then if there was any socialist themes on top of it, I think that's people more looking into it because that's what they want to find there. The only other extra detail or thing to think about this book was how real is it? So, for example, when Dora dies, it's because she's rescued from this kind of nunnery where she's been placed, and she dies of fever in the care of the Capitães Da Areia. How long can you keep cheating at cards and threatening people with daggers before you get called on it? How fun is the homelessness when the weather is shite? To be fair, the book is not all sunshine and lollipops. We do see, okay, bad things happen to these kids, and we see them have to grieve for people who die, have to make hard decisions and things like this. It's just that, so it does present the bad side. It's just that it's still in this haze, and I don't know if it's the childhood haze or if just the way that he wrote. Perhaps this is a Brazilian haze, but it lacks the kind of grittiness you'll find that I think would actually occur in situations like this. It lacks some of the reality of, okay, for example, they make love on the sand all the time in this book with the like the young Negro girls is what they say. How fun is it actually having sex on sand? Like, sand is just going to get in all of the places, and it doesn't mention that. It just mentions how good it is and how fun it is. So I think there's some of the unpleasantness or realness that you'll find within illness, depression, death, things like this is kind of glossed over in the book. So when you're reading it, just know that it is going to have this feel to it, which gets into my summary. It's a pretty story, but one for the starry-eyed. So it's probably, honestly, more suited for teenagers to read this book. It's a nice taste of Brazilian culture. I did struggle to connect with some parts, and there were some things where I was just like, I don't understand why that character did that or what they're even talking about here. But nevertheless, it's a Brazilian book. That's to be expected. There was just some things that required probably some pre-knowledge of knowing about beforehand, which did make the book harder to read for me, for sure. If I was a Brazilian teenager, this book would probably be pretty fantastic. Might even reflect my own childhood in certain ways, especially if I grew up by the beach, or if I was in the Bahia area of Salvador, things like this. So I can see why this, if I did Capoeira, for example, I could see why this is like a book that you could connect with. Me being Australian, there actually wasn't that much for me to connect with. So it was a decent story, but I honestly got more value from learning the Portuguese rather than the book itself. So overall, Capitães da Areia, I guess the translation of that would be Captains of the Sands. I'm going to give this book, it's a 5.5 out of 10. It was an okay read. I'm glad I did, but will I rave about this in the future? No, probably not. Similar books recommendations, probably the one that jumps out at me most is just because of the story and the way it's told. I would say something like Lord of the Flies by William Golding. That actually has more of that gritty realness to it, I think, than this book, even though it is still a little bit. No, it's got more realness to it, for sure. And I already mentioned Gabriel Garcia Marquez. As I said, like the magic realism, this book isn't magic realism. There's none of that in here. Kind of a little bit with the religious stuff and the weather that occurs, but in total, it's kind of got the feel of magic realism without being actually magic realism. Is probably how I would say that. So if you enjoy magic realism, you might enjoy this book, and vice versa. So that's it for today. This is a value for value podcast. So if you got any value from this, I would just ask if you could return that in some shape or form. There is no advertising. There is no sponsorships. I am not being, paid to promote these books. These are books that I'm just finding on my own because I love them and want to explain them to the world. So if you could support back in some sort of way, value for value, that would be very much appreciated. I really do. Obviously, the simple stuff, sharing this book with someone, liking the YouTube, sharing the audio just via social media, that is very much appreciated. If you want to follow the channel as well, that certainly does help out and lets you know when more content is being produced. If you want to give me some recommendations, some talent, I would certainly love that. If you've gone through some of my previous book reviews, that would be very much appreciated. And give me some recommendations. What do you think I should read? Any insights that I've perhaps missed into these books? Reach out, put it on a YouTube comment, or you can finally send in some monetary support, because it does take a lot of time, energy, and money to produce all of these things. So doing that via the PayPal, Mere Mortals, there's a link down in the show notes. And then also, if you want to support us via a boostergram on a Podcasting 2.0 app for the audio version, going to somewhere like Fountain, Podverse, TrueFans, Podcast Guru, all these sorts of places, you're able to do that there. More info on that is at meremortalspodcast.com/support. So thank you very much for joining in. As I mentioned, the live and the times in the future will change. I am leaving Brazil as of tomorrow, so the live time of this podcast will change. The date it's released might get changed in the future. I'm going to be traveling in New Zealand for a couple of weeks, so still unsure of if I'll be doing live ones, if Juan will do a book review. We'll figure all that and see how that goes. And then upcoming book reviews. I've got Crossing the Chasm, which I have read. I'm reading Washington Irving at the moment. I'm reading some Jack Ellul at the moment, and I'm reading some Tolstoy at the moment, of all people. So quite a few things, coming up in the future. So yeah, that's it. Thank you everyone for joining for this last book review from Brazil, of a Brazilian book. Ciao for now. Karen out.